I am so excited to do this. So before I tell you a little bit about Dr. Taylor, I just want to say this is our first, the first hopefully of many expert talks. And so one of the things that we really want to do at SLF, San Francisco Bay Area, is bring people who know things about topics that are really relevant to science fiction fantasy writers, like viruses, right? Like those kinds of topics, and give us that extra knowledge that might help us take our writing to the next level. Okay, so this will be hopefully the first of many expert talks. So specifically about Dr. Kishana Taylor, she is a powerhouse in science. She has degrees in animal science, public health, microbiology, and emerging infectious disease, and interdisciplinary biomedical sciences. Her most recent scientific work focuses on the role of monocytes in the development of severe COVID-19. So she's got a lot of stuff that I'm sure she's gonna tell us about. She's also a huge fantasy and sci-fi fan and loves the Servants of Fate series by Sarah Fine. So we thought she would be a fantastic person to come and talk to us about viruses and whatever else that she's about to say. So with that, and unless I'm looking at Becca to see if there's anything else before I hand the mic over to Dr. Taylor. Okay, awesome, there you go.
Okay, great. Okay, so I have slides. We'll put those up. Okay, so I want to start off this talk by first of all saying thank you to Jasmine and everyone else at the San Francisco Bay Area section of the Speculative Literature Foundation for inviting me tonight. I'm really honored. As mentioned, I'm a super big fantasy and sci-fi fan, and so to be able to give a talk that could then influence future books that I'm probably going to read is great, right? So I'm like, oh, I know, I did, okay. But anyway, so essentially what I'm going to talk to you today about is how to incorporate virology and the science of viruses, and even if we want to get into it, other microorganisms into your science fiction. My argument today is going to be that while viruses are really interesting and I've dedicated my whole life to them, in terms of literature, I think it's really important to remember that the reason why viruses are scary or why they make a compelling story is because they show our vulnerabilities, both biologically and socially, right? Because more often than not, you can't get a virus unless you've gotten it from another person. And so I think that's key to remember in our storytelling. And so as I go through, I'll try and convince you why that's a reasonable argument. And so I wanted to start off with why include viruses in your science fiction. Again, so I think viruses make great villains or antagonists to a story, right? They expose our biological and social vulnerabilities. But in addition to that, it helps to incorporate more science into the story, especially if you're focusing on science fiction. Viruses require interdisciplinary knowledge of the way that a human body functions. If you're thinking specifically of human viruses or an animal body or even plant viruses, they all have their own biology, and this, right, brings the science into your science fiction. And even when we think about made up viruses or made up science, it's usually built off of some basis of real life science, what we know. And I think regular science is pretty fantastic even before you add the fiction portion to it, right? And so third, which is also another passion of mine as a virologist, is that your stories can be a way to get people interested in virology, into science. And something that I do in my spare time is I have founded, or am in the process of founding, a nonprofit that focuses on getting Black virologists and microbiologists together in the same space to be able to create that community within each other and better ourselves as scientists in a safe community, similar to kind of the statement that was said at the beginning of the presentation. And so I think these are all really great reasons to include science fiction into, or not science, to include virology into your science fiction. So I wanted to start briefly by going over what viruses are. I think having an understanding of what we're trying to write about helps you to write more authentically and tell stories that are believable to those who do know a little bit more about viruses than the average person. And so basically viruses are a combination of proteins and nucleic acids, right? So if you look at this figure over here, you have nucleic acid. In this case, it looks like it's DNA encased inside of some proteins here, and then encased inside of another protein, as well as a lipid membrane, which is sometimes a thing, sometimes not a thing. But basically, this is all to say that viruses are not alive. They don't survive outside of a living organism, or more specifically a cell, a living cell. They require cells to survive. And so I'll get into this a little bit later. So when we talk about things like zombie viruses, it really irks me because viruses don't live in dead people, so they couldn't. But anyway, well, I'll get to that. Typically, viruses will have a particular target. And while this is a fairly flexible rule, sometimes viruses have multiple targets. They usually will majority target one thing. So, right, there'll be like a virus that targets your neurons. That would consider a neurotropism. Or like in the case of current pandemic, we have a virus that is theoretically supposed to target your lung cells, but we see that it's doing a bunch of other things as well. So that's kind of a flexible rule. And then I also wanted to point out that viruses are not bacteria. And so oftentimes in lay audiences, people can get them confused. And so if you have a viral infection, that's different from a bacterial infection. If you have antibiotics will not treat a viral infection. They will only treat a bacterial infection, I think some fungal infections, but both bacteria and fungi are living cells that can replicate on their own, more or less. Viruses cannot do that. Viruses require the host or a host in order to replicate, to survive, and pass such genetic material on to the next generation. So I thought it made sense to kind of go over some common virus tropes. So things that I've seen in the sci-fi literature, in the fantasy literature when we talk about viruses. And so some common virus tropes, and even some things that we've seen, right, in terms of theories of where SARS coronavirus 2 has come from, you kind of see them playing out in both, because life imitates art and vice versa, right? Okay, so we have some common tropes. Government created and released this virus, whether it's accidental or on purpose. And so we see this a lot. I've seen it a lot more, I think, in like TV shows or in movies than I have seen them in books, but it does happen. And I'll talk about one of those a little bit later when I get into specific examples. Mutations. So a lot of writing a lot of literature will talk about a virus that maybe started out maybe not as bad, and then some crazy mutation happens and now it does all of the things, and we're all just in really, really big, deep trouble. And then the third one is zombie viruses or zombie-like viruses. And so I will get into more detail when I talk about The Walking Dead on the next slide, as to why I think most of these tropes, while if used well, can be okay. A lot of the times they end up taking me out of the story as someone who has a little bit more background knowledge in virology. So I originally was going to do this and share a couple of examples myself and then ask the audience for examples, but y'all can't talk. So we'll just talk about all my examples, and that works fine. So stories that have viruses as part of the plot. So the first one, whenever I think about this, that comes to mind is the Maze Runner series. It's done a fairly decent job of talking about this virus specifically. It's called the flare. And so the Maze Runner series actually uses all three of the most common tropes that I just talked about on the last slide. And so the underlying plot of the Maze Runner is that there was this huge solar flare that destroyed most of the world. And there was this government virus specifically held in like a CDC type location in the southern US that the government had created. And after the solar flare, they thought that it would be perfect for decreasing the population so that there were more people who would be able to survive on the limited resources that they have. And so they release it into the population, and then it mutates, right? And so originally it was supposed to kill fairly quickly, painlessly, just, to get people off of the resources that they had, and it mutates. And so now, instead of killing people really quickly, it's a really slow killing virus. It causes you to more or less lose all of your humanity. And so you start doing things that you wouldn't necessarily do. if you look at the novel versus the movie adaptation, in the movie, these infected people, which are also called cranks, can like lose feeling in their body. So like they lose their nose or like their arm, and they don't even notice. So basically they become similar to zombies, but a little bit more functional in that they can still talk and walk. They just don't have any morality to them. And so I think the Maze Runner is a great example, one of all of the virus tropes that I was talking about before. But I think the story is pretty compelling, right? You have these kids who somehow are all immune to this virus, and so they're studying them to kind of understand how they can create a cure for this virus that has mutated and gone out of control and is killing the entire human population. And I think what makes the story compelling more so than the viruses is the people. So you get to learn about the characters and their fight against getting out of this maze, which is how they're being studied to look for differences in their body. And they go through like all of these trials and tribulations. They run into these people who are infected. They have to avoid getting infected themselves, all to solve this essential pandemic for this virus. What doesn't work, or what for me as a virologist pulls me out, is that this virus seems to do all of the things. Typically viruses in real life don't do all of the things. They usually choose, right? They're not alive, but they usually have a particular path that they take. And in particular with viruses that cause like encephalitis or meningitis, so like swelling of the brain or the tissues that surround the brain, which would be what would theoretically be causing the change in morality, like the change in behavior. If you're having an infection that's inside of your brain and causing swelling in your brain, it's not going to last months at a time. Like it's just not, it's going to end up taking out your brainstem. You're not gonna be able to breathe. You're not gonna be able to walk. You would have additional symptoms. And so these prolonged infections, typically you won't see in viruses that infect your brain, because there's so much important machinery in your brain that your body would ultimately shut down, right? And so in theory, the flare, the virus from the Maze Runner, should be killing these people a lot faster than what the story is saying that they're doing. Oftentimes chronic viruses that take a long time to take effect or to break down your body, they attack important organs, but it's usually, right, like something that you can kind of get away with not having if you're in the right situation. So an example of something that's chronic that takes a long time to kill or basically shut down its host would be HIV. So HIV is a chronic virus. It infects your cell, it infects the cells, and then it incorporates itself into your DNA. And because it does that, it basically has the ability to hide from some of your immune functions. And then it also attacks the immune system. And that's eventually how you die, right? AIDS is basically your loss of immune function. So you can't fight off disease and you end up dying of something really rare that most people don't have because they have functional immune systems. And so while your immune system is very important, you can't live without it. It takes a long time to break down all of the cells within your body that comprise your immune system. And then you also have to be faced with an infection before you start to really experience symptoms and pass away. And so you can see that's really different from a neurotropic virus that is going to go straight to your brain. It's going to make your brain swell. It's potentially killing cells in your brain. That's more of a quicker way to die than something coming after your immune system or a particular organ like hepatitis, so your liver, right? You can theoretically live without your liver if you don't drink too much for a while. So it's kind of one or the other usually. That's not to say that there aren't exceptions to those rules, but they have to be really well written, and you have to understand, right, the underlying biology, the underlying immunology for it to make convincing sense, for it to not pull you out. Let's see, so The Walking Dead is a really great example. So The Walking Dead is about a zombie virus. And so the virus infects you while you're alive, and then it activates after you die. And so this is really problematic because, as I said before, viruses require living cells to replicate and to survive and to pass on their material to the next generation of viruses. And so getting infected while you're alive makes sense, but then for it to reanimate, there's just a lot of science missing in between the infection and then reanimation as someone who dies. And so that completely makes the story unrealistic to me in that sense. But The Walking Dead is a really famous, like really popular show and graphic novel series, right? And I think this kind of goes along to what I was saying before. It's really about the people and it's about the sociology that happens behind the story. And so while I'm not a huge Walking Dead fan, I don't like zombies, they freak me out. People can still get into it, even if it's not super scientifically accurate, because the storytelling is really good. And the characters compel you to want to learn more and to make sure that your favorite survives and all of those things. And so that's kind of just to say that I understand that in writing, specifically science fiction, specifically fiction in general, you don't have to stick to the rules, right? You just have to be able to tell a story that's good enough that people can look past those rules. But if you want to stick to the rules, which I love when stories stick to the rules, because I think they can also be really scary on their own when they do things that are biologically relevant. So some other examples I have, my favorite series, which was talked about by Jasmine, is the Servants of Fate series. And so kind of what goes on behind this is that there's a family that's in the business of transporting people from life to the afterlife. And then they also have what we call the Reapers. So these are people who work for the Grim Reaper, and they're the ones who basically orchestrate the deaths of the people that then the Servants of Fate carry over to the afterworld. And so these stories take place in another like post-apocalyptic type setting where the sea level rises have risen really high. So Boston is basically like all like Venice now, like, right? So there's lots of waterways, lots of travel via water, but the water is, because of the changes in the climate, the water is super contaminated with different viruses and bacteria and all that stuff. So people are dying really gruesome deaths from all of these infectious diseases. And so the story kind of circles around this scientist who is coming up with what we call a universal vaccine. So it's one vaccine, but you're able to kind of switch out the main component of the vaccine in that, like, you can change it from the flu virus to a coronavirus to some bacteria. So it's like a streptococcus or whatever. But it does a really good job of giving you the background information you need to know about how vaccines work. And it's realistic enough that I can be like, oh yeah, I know people are trying to work on universal viruses. That totally makes sense. And while it's not like, it doesn't go into super nitty gritty scientific detail, it hits enough points for me that I'm like, okay, I can totally believe this. This makes sense. Even though it's talking about, right, Grim Reapers and angels who transport people from one part of life to the other. There's also some romance in there, which is great. And so that's one of my favorite series. And I think it does a really good job of balance. And so I think balance is really important. And then I think on the not doing a good job at all, really, really terrible, we have Doctor Who, which is a TV series, so it's not written. But in the last season, they said it was a virus, but I'm pretty sure they meant bacteria, which is already like a huge thing. But anyway, so there's this organism that supposedly spawned from plastic and microplastics. And they're able to infect plastic, but then now they're also able to infect humans because we've been consuming all of these microplastics as a part of like too much plastic production in the world. And so you have this virus, which needs living cells to live, that's growing in plastic, but then can now infect living things because we're infected with plastic, and it's like super convoluted and it makes no sense at all. And then they cure the virus by taking bird enzymes, and it makes no sense at all. And I was like really annoyed throughout the entire episode, and it really pulled me out of the story, and I couldn't follow it at all. So don't be like the Doctor Who writers, because it was really, really terrible. And then there's another example of the movie The Crazies, and that kind of is a virus similar to the flare, and that the government releases this virus accidentally into the water supply of this town in Iowa. And it basically turns you into a crazy zombie type thing. And this family has to basically escape its town and escape the zombie virus while the government tries to clean up its mess. But we've already talked about why that storyline is a little problematic. Next slide. Okay, and so in addition to just giving you those examples, I also wanted to take some lessons from the pandemic, because there's always an exception to every rule, and SARS-CoV-2 seems to be that exception. In terms of it's kind of doing a lot of things. It is a respiratory virus, but it's causing a lot of different symptoms and pathologies that we wouldn't necessarily see with a regular respiratory virus. And so if you were going to skew from the tropism rule, we'll call it a rule, following something that SARS-CoV-2 does would be a good way to do it, because, right, we see that this can actually happen in nature. But in addition to that, if you have looked at the development of research over the course, or even information released to the public over the course of the pandemic, you would see that good virology is interdisciplinary. So we've had people who work specifically on the biology of a virus, of this virus. So who it's infecting, how it's infecting, right? The different receptors in a cell, those sorts of things. Then you have people who are looking specifically at how the virus changes over time. So that's how we know about the new SARS-2 variant that came out of the UK. And then there are some other variants from other countries. And then you have the folks working with methods of protection. So whether or not masks work, what kind of masks work, how far does aerosol spread, when you sneeze, when you cough, when you talk, etc. So good virology is interdisciplinary. And also viruses can be scary, right? Even if they don't do all the crazy things at once, which is what I've said before. And that oftentimes symptoms from viral infections are not only because of damage caused by the virus itself. So the issue with severe COVID-19 is that your body is starting to fight against the virus, but it's also then destroying itself in the process. And so I think when you're writing a virus into your story, it's important to remember that the virus might not be doing too much damage in and of itself, but it's causing your body to freak out enough that your body starts to fight back, and it's destroying itself from the inside. And so that can kind of give you a little bit of a twist, right? Because then you don't have to write this super biology defying virus. You can just, write about this little virus that just happens to freak your immune system out and cause, relative shutdown in whatever way that you see fit. And then finally, that host behavior is key to transmission. And so when the pandemic first started, if you had asked me about SARS-CoV-2, I'd have been like, yes, I mean, it's infecting people. It's a little scary, but we're going to put in the right restrictions, and we're going to make sure that everybody has a mask, and, everyone's going to do their part to like stop the curve or shorten the curve, and it'll be fine. But what we've seen over the course of the year is that that's not what happened, right? The government kind of did some stuff, they kind of did some stuff. Some people want to wear masks and like protect themselves. Other people are like, this isn't even real, so I'm not even gonna protect myself about it. Other people are like, well, I kind of want to go on vacation, so like, whatever. And so I think when you're writing your stories, that host behavior, right, is a key part of that, because it's not even really about the virus, because if the virus doesn't have a host, it's not going anywhere. And so I think if you can write your characters to maybe even propel viral spread in a way that seems realistic, which at this point, basically anything goes after this pandemic. I feel like you can get away with a whole lot more than I would have said like 2 years ago. So I think that would be fine. And so you absolutely, now, if anyone calls you out, you'd be like, well, with SARS-CoV-2, they did this, this, and this, and it turned out this way. So you can't really argue with that. But again, I think your characters, your protagonists, really make the story, and they can actually make the virus look better or worse, depending on what they do. And so that's really important to remember too. And so to summarize, what makes a good virus story? So I think you have to know at least a little bit, do your background research on a number of different topics that kind of revolve around virology and like basic infectious disease, right? So epidemiology, which is kind of how the virus is spreading. Is it being spread by essential workers? Is it being spread by people who are not following the rules and still gathering in large groups, those sorts of things. Etiology, so where did the virus come from? Did the government make it? Did it come from a bat? Did it come from a mosquito, which are my favorite kind of viruses, the ones that come from mosquitoes. So I will promote any book that you write that has a mosquito-borne virus in it, I promise. Does it, does it have a mutation? If so, what kind of mutation? Those sorts of things. Basic virology, so just understanding what viruses are, what they're not. So when you're writing, if someone comes up with a cure, it's not that they, combine 3 different kinds of antibiotics, right? Because antibiotics don't work against viruses, those sorts of things. Immunology. So as I was saying before, sometimes it's not that the virus is causing damage, it's that your body is causing the damage. So if you're going to incorporate that into your story, very general, you don't have to know like different immune cell types and cytokines and all that stuff, but just, understand that there are certain viruses that can affect your immune system and what that means, and how that will affect your characters, right? And then most importantly, in my opinion, is human behavior. And that often gets left out of the science, like the STEM conversations, but as people who are in literature and likely get a lot more social science than some of the scientists, I think it'll be easier for you to do probably than most of us. But human behavior is the most important one, because regardless, you need hosts, you need human behavior, you need things that are going to propel your virus forward enough for it to even be a big enough of a plot issue. And so you got to know that human behavior, you got to write that into your stories. And I think that's really, really important. And so this actually went faster than when I practiced it. So it's supposed to be 30 minutes, but it's only been 25. But I am open for questions or suggestions or anything. I don't know how, Jasmine, how you want to do this, but.
We do have at least one question for you so far.
Okay.
Which, have you heard of the domesticating cholera idea?
No, what is the domesticating cholera?
So here's what I'm going to do actually is unmute this particular asker to try to explain more and maybe get your ideas on it. So Maya, I'm asking to unmute you.
Hi, sorry, I didn't, yeah, anyway, okay, sorry, wasn't expecting to actually be on. So yeah, it was something that I read in a surgeon wrote a book called Complications, and in one of the final chapters, he talked about this idea of domesticating diseases in order to make them less brutal when we experience them. And the 2 examples he spoke of were both cholera outbreaks, and one in India and one in like Colombia, I believe, or South America rather. And it was an example of the population making their water supply more cleaner and more reliable, resulted in a strain of cholera that was less brutal on the human body. Because again, I'm anthropomorphizing the virus here, but by being less deadly to humans, it was able to survive in the human body longer, so that humans were more likely to pass it on to somebody else. By making the people less sick, they were up and about and thus more likely to pass it on. And I thought it was one of the most paradigm shifting ideas I had ever heard, this idea of both domesticating viruses and how it seems to be a two-way street of, if we as humans make an environment where we're safer from the virus makes itself more likely, more companionable, for lack of a better term, in order for it to continue surviving.
Sure. Okay. So 2 things. One, cholera in particular is a bacteria, but that's okay, because the theory still applies either way. And yes, it's basic evolutionary theory. So when you think about pathogens, microorganisms in general, who cause disease, it's typically because they require that host for a protein, or all of the proteins in the case of viruses or something like that. And so if they want to survive, they have to have other humans to survive in. And so that can look one of many ways. And so evolutionary theory can kind of go in multiple directions, right? So you can either go in the, I'm going to be super lethal so that no matter who I run into, everyone gets infected and I can move on to the next host. Evolutionary theory being at some point you run out of hosts and then you die. So that's probably not the best way to go. And then the other arm of evolutionary theory is, well, if I continue to evolve with this host so that they continue to live and survive and pass me on to the next person, and if that's through not having as severe of symptoms, right, so that you can still kind of walk around and pass it on to other people, then that makes sense. And so we see that even, I mean, we see it with a common cold, with non-pandemic strains of flu. I mean, we kind of see it with coronavirus, right? Most people are asymptomatic, and so that's how it's still been able to spread, because those people are still walking around infectious and living their everyday life and spreading the virus around. So I've never heard it expressed as domesticating it before, but yes, it's basic evolutionary theory, so that could totally work. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. I have a couple more questions for you. One is there a way to write a virus that only affects certain humans based on DNA or something like that? Or is that really not realistic?
Yeah, it's like, if I read a story about it, I'd be like, okay, I'm gonna run with it. But in my head, I'd be like, no, right? Because like, yes, there are differences in humans based on their DNA, but really we're not, like, in the grand scheme of things, like when you really look at like our whole genetic sequences, we're not that different from each other. And so anything that infects one group of people is going to infect the next group of people, unless it's a genetic mutation that messes with their immune system, right? So they're immune compromised. So immune compromised people get some illnesses that other people don't get, but immune compromised people don't make up the majority of a population. So I guess if you said this mutation in the DNA took over, and so now everyone is immune compromised, or like this group of 100,000 people is immune compromised, but everybody else is not, then yes, you could do it that way. But see, that's why it's important to know immunology too a little bit, right? Right? See?
Mm-hmm. Ways we can make it work. That's a virologist agree with us. That's exciting. So next question is, do you have any thoughts on viruses being trapped in like cells underground or in ice? I mean, that does keep coming up in like the news, is that like we're going to be under threat of climate change bringing old viruses. So what do you think about that?
Yes. And I will say that nothing is impossible, but some things are more probable than others. I think if there is a chance, it would have to be, so this is going like a little bit deeper into the virology. It would have to be a particular kind of virus. One that's not, so remember I was talking about in the beginning, I said like that particular virus had an envelope. Typically envelope viruses are kind of wimpy, which is one of the other reasons why I thought SARS-CoV-2 was not going to be like a thing, because it's envelope and pretty easy to kill. If it was going to survive in ice, it would have to be really cold. So scientists, we freeze things at like -80, which is what the Pfizer vaccine is being stored at. So it's not like super probable that there's just going to be -80 degrees anywhere on Earth for an extended period of time, but maybe in the permafrost. I don't actually know what temperature the permafrost is, so potentially. So it would have to be really, really cold, like -80 cold. It could, I guess, in that case, if it's super cold, then it could be either enveloped or non-enveloped. But like if it's less than -80, it would probably have to be a non-enveloped virus for it to survive. So yes, possible, probably not probable though. But I would totally read a story on it if you can make it work.
I think that's a great answer.
Yeah.
Next question. Is it at all plausible for a virus to mutate to different forms depending on the genome of the host? Like people with one mutation could shed a different form of the virus than people without that mutation?
Yeah, that's kind of what's happening now. So we're talking about the different variants in SARS coronavirus, right? So we have the new UK variant that's more infectious than the original virus that we were seeing circulated over the last year. And so some people are getting infected with that, and it's taking over. And so, but for a while, right, you would see dual transmission of both, the one that's more infectious and the one that's not, but then eventually the more infectious virus is outcompeting the other. So you could have multiple viruses. And I mean, there's other mutation variants that we've found in the US and South Africa and other places. So there are definitely certain viruses circulating in different populations, but should that virus then be introduced into the other populations, they will compete, and whichever one is the strongest will eventually win out.
Interesting. Another question. See, people got questions for you. What would be some ways to defeat the villain virus? Vaccine, preventing transmission, no more viable hosts?
All of the above. It depends on how you want. If you want a happy ending, I would say probably vaccine or preventing transmission. If you're like a fan of tragedy, which is, if done right, is okay. I'll probably cry, but you could totally be, everybody died, so the virus is gone because I don't have anybody to replicate it anymore. That's totally a thing.
Do we have any more questions? I will give people a second to put in more questions. And I feel as though you need to see the comment of, I feel like she's bringing science back, JT style. Here we go.
20-year-old JT obsessed me is very happy right now. Thank you.
Any more questions coming in through chat?
I actually have a question. I guess I'm wondering what you can tell us a little bit about like the sciencey background behind, say, an airborne virus versus a virus like COVID-19 that's not airborne. Like what might we need to know if we're going to decide, right? If I'm trying to decide, okay, is the virus going to be airborne or is it not going to be airborne?
Yeah, so I think for writing, I think deciding, so an airborne virus basically means that people who are inhaling or excreting the virus through their nose or their mouth, once the virus is in the environment, it kind of stays in the air for longer periods of time. So like, right, the issue with SARS-CoV-2 is that when you breathe, eventually the droplets kind of hit the floor, or most of the time don't spread more than like 6 feet because there's a lot more, I'm trying to find the right word to, like, I guess there's a lot more wetness to the excretion. And so it makes it like more heavy versus something like measles, which is airborne and hangs in the air for hours. And so anyone who walks into a room with someone who has measles is more than likely going to get infected. So, right, so if we kind of dig into the epidemiology a little bit, and kind of when we were looking at the beginning of the pandemic, everyone kept talking about this thing called R0 or R0. And so SARS-CoV-2 has an R0 of like 2 or 3. So for every one person that's infected, it spreads to an additional 2 or 3 people. I'm not sure what the new variant is, but that's what our like original science says. The R0 for measles is 12. And so, yeah. And so that's the difference between something that's like majority airborne versus something that's only airborne in like really perfect circumstances. It's likely going to be more infectious, and it's likely going to stay in the air for long periods of time without like filtration or something else to kind of mitigate the virus being in the air.
We do have another question for you. How small of a population can a virus reasonably circulate indefinitely in?
That's a really good question, and it really depends on the virus. It depends on the R0. It depends on what the symptoms are for someone who comes down with that virus. I mean, in general, you would have to have at least a couple thousand people for. Well, is it a closed population? Is it a closed population? So like it's whatever that population is, no one's having babies, no one's, immigrating in or out, then that because those questions will change a little bit. If you have people coming in and out of the community or out of that population, if you have production of new population members, then theoretically, right, if I had to give you a number, like 50,000, I think would be okay. Because you're still bringing in new members, but if it's a closed population, once everybody gets sick, then there's nowhere else to go.
I think that's a good answer without knowing for sure all of those factors. And I think those are great factors actually to point out that we need to consider when we're writing about it. I think that's fantastic. I have a question for you. In this pandemic year, has any of this felt like science fiction to you? And how the coronavirus has existed and spread and all of the above?
How it has spread? Yeah, like, so I would not have believed that a government would behave in the way that it's behaving if I had read it in a book before 2020. The way the virus works, like we've studied coronaviruses before, we've seen that, like I've been studying pandemics for years, all this stuff makes sense. I would not have expected the government to behave this way and for the population to then like follow along with it, right? Like you could have maybe written in an incompetent government because those exist everywhere and in stories all over the place. But usually, right, in stories at least that I read a lot of young adult fiction, so that might be why. But they eventually, like people eventually like fight back and, you know, they're like, no, this is wrong, or we're gonna do it on our own because obviously the government can't figure it out. But I mean, we've seen some of that, but there's still just a large number of people that I wouldn't have, like my brain still like can't completely wrap around what has happened in the last year in that respect.
I think that's a good answer. I do have one more question that just came in. So this is about reinfection. If someone who was infected and recovered likely to be reinfected if re-exposed to the same strain of a virus, or just by like a mutated new strain?
Same strain, no. Mutated strain, yes. If the virus mutates enough. And so a good real life example of this is the flu virus, right? So we have to get a flu shot every year because flu mutates at an insane rate. But it also has another process that not all viruses have, in that the genome for the flu virus is segmented. And so I actually studied this for my postdoc at UC Davis. So like I know all about this. This is my favorite thing. But the flu virus genome is segmented. And if more than one flu virus gets into the same cell at the same time, viruses can, for lack of a better term, swap those segments during replication and create brand new viruses. And so if someone was infected with one of those strains and then that strain it's called reassortment. If one of those strains reassorted with another strain, that same person could then likely be reinfected with the new one, depending on how the new genome is arranged. But I mean, you see it in non-reassortments too, but it just requires a lot of cycles. So like if I got infected this month with whatever imaginary virus you're thinking of, and it's just mutation based, I would say if it's rapidly spreading through the population, I could probably get infected in the next year or two. If it's moving slowly throughout the population, it would probably take a little bit longer.
I think that might be all of our questions. Do you have any more, Jasmine, that I'm unaware of?
No, I do not.
Okay.
Thank you to Maya, who keeps putting all the links in the chat. She's awesome.
Yes.
She's awesome.
Okay. Maya is of helpfulness for us. Thank you, Maya. I also wanted to, before we let everybody go, let folks know Maya actually runs World Forge Writers, which is a Silicon Valley-based writers group, meetup group, and they are having a talk in February that is with a nurse. And I had that right on here. And of course it disappeared. So let me get that link to share with you all, but it's going to be a talk with a nurse for writers as well. So you can get kind of a healthcare perspective. Here it is. Let me copy that into the chat, which I think could be very helpful to attend. Oh, and look at that, Maya's faster than me because she is on top of things. Thank you, Maya. So yeah, so all of you might be really interested in checking out that as well. We are going to have future events once a month. We do I mentioned earlier, we do the writing sprints. And we do expert talks like this one, and we also will bring to you more panels. We're working on one right now that I think is going to be, not certain, don't hold me to it, but I think it's going to be what publishing professionals wish that first-time authors knew before getting your first book published. So helpful information in that regard, but we don't have the details ironed out for all of those yet. And yes, we have in the chat, we have the link for if you want to support the National Speculative Literature Organization, you can sign up to be a member for $2 a month, and all of that money goes to supporting speculative literature at large. And we also have our own Ancestral Futures, which Jasmine and Audrey, our co-organizers, run. Definitely check them out to see what they are up to, and if you'd like to support them and their work to lift up speculative fiction writers of the African diaspora, I believe. Oh, and also, and people of color in general, so Black and people of color in general. And thank you all so much for coming today. I don't think I have anything else to say. Do you, Jasmine? No?
I wish we were all in a room and we could just like applaud Dr. Taylor. This was fantastic. Thank you so much for spending your, Sunday, it's evening for you, right?
Yeah, it's almost 8 o'clock here.
Yeah, thanks for spending your Sunday evening with us. This was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Yay. I'm clapping for you guys because this was great and you had good questions. Yay.